FEINART is an innovative training network examining the future of European independent art spaces in the period of socially engaged art. It is jointly led by the University of Wolverhampton, Zeppelin University, University of Iceland, and University of Edinburgh, with the support from the Marie Curie Action. I'm one of the researchers for the program, and it's an absolute pleasure for me to be introducing Dan and Christoph. Both of them are internationally renowned artists, known for their work on community development and innovative strategies for social engagement. And fun fact, they have known each other for years, so they will be sharing some of this local knowledge, wisdom, and their friendship with us today. Dan has been working on the intersection of art and ecology since the mid-80s. He's currently an associate professor at the University of Illinois and the co-founder of the Experimental Station, an early influential model of cultural activism in Chicago. It's now an incubator and a safe space for small-scale social enterprise and cultural projects. And Christoph works on urban everyday life and the production of space for and by collective desires. One of his most notable works is the independent urban planning as art and activism project, Park Fiction in Hamburg, which has become a global aspiration and hope for many redevelopment projects. And before I give you Dan and Chris, I would like to give you a quick run through of the schedule and some housekeeping reminders. We will start off with the artist talk for around 20 minutes, and there will be a conversation between the artist, moderated by Professor Kahan Vandenberg of Zeppelin University and myself for another 20 minutes. And then we'll open the floor for Q&A. And during the Q&A, you can use the raise hand button to ask questions directly, or if you prefer, you can use the chat box options. And finally, this lecture, as you know, it will be recorded and will be available on feinart.org. And now I want to say a very warm welcome to Dan and Christoph.
Hello.
Thank you everybody for showing
Dan,
up.
you're going to start, right?
Yeah, okay. I think I'm going to go into screen share mode. Well, maybe I'll say hi while people can see my face just for a second before I become a voice. Thank you to all the organizers and collaborators and the team of universities involved. Karen, YY, Christoph, it's been a pleasure just kind of having these contacts in place and putting this conversation together. So I'm happy to be a part of it. I just want to mention that we had talked about a very rapid run through of about a 10-minute presentation, both of what I do as an artist and 30 years of the organization that I've been involved with. So it's, of course, an impossible task that both Christoph and I will be doing. So I'm going to run through some slides quickly so you get some sense of the kind of art projects I've been making, and then we'll kind of skip back to the kind of historical run through of the organization, the Experimental Station. The Experimental Station is of course searchable on its own website to get a glimpse of how it presents itself today, and I'll be mostly talking about a kind of evolving history that goes back to the into the early 90s. So I'm going to not talk a lot about what you can find now on the website for how the organization currently defines itself. So with that, I'm going to screen share and go through my talk. Let me get rid of the controls and go to full. Okay. Does everybody have this image?
Yeah, perfect.
And you can hear me okay?
Yes.
Because I'm all by myself in my room here. Okay. I'm going to, as I said, just run through some art projects. And I do really use the word project because I think a lot through materials and kind of extended histories of materials and often long time frames where I come back to certain materials and certain sites and industrial processes and ecological design issues and so forth. So I can touch on just a few basic bits of information around these projects. This is called Running Table. It sits in Millennium Park in Chicago, and it's a fabrication made of post-consumer plastics, a kind of endless table design. So, something that put waste materials back into a public space in almost a form that could capture ongoing production, endless production, right? So the modular strategies are often part of my way of recognizing a kind of overproduction and, dealing with design questions of really vast scales of materials and waste materials. A few projects related to this have involved, skate objects, public plaza accessories, kind of mute modular structures that really take significant amounts of these plastics and put them back into a public dialogue, even though it's often a kind of quiet presence in public space. But it's something that is very attentive to the waste systems and the production systems and the recycling systems that the materials are borrowed from or kind of now operate parallel to. A similar material, but a different recycling industrial chain. This is also recycled plastics, post-consumer, completely random color mix of extruded recycled plastics, and again, a kind of modular form like Running Table, a sort of endless expanse of material. This has been in place for about 20 years in Chicago, and what began as a sculpture project was adopted as a summer dance floor, a festival for public dancing in the years prior to the pandemic. Right now, it's back to being a little more of a sculptural earthwork. I'll give you a little taste of Chicago here, pre-pandemic. One more project with this material, looking at the petrochemical molecules as a kind of data. This is a 1-ton archive where the plastic components are both integrated in the architecture in the floor and the kind of surrogate book objects on the shelves. A piece called Civilian Defense. This was done for the Sharjah Biennial. Domestic upholstery fabric, sandbag units, and then configured into a kind of bunker reminiscent of civilian defense structures, flood control, military bunkers, checkpoints, so forth. It's now in the collection of the Van Abbe Museum, and is used as a very adaptable, kind of flexible piece of furniture and meeting space. The Universal Lab. This was a project shaped around surplus equipment from the laboratories of the University of Chicago, which is the neighborhood of Chicago that I'll be talking about in relation to the experimental station. In this case, materials were scavenged by lab technicians who had a kind of a pirate off-grid laboratory research center stockpile for years in Chicago. And so this project kind of explored this offshoot of surplus lab equipment and discarded lab equipment that really operated for decades. So again, not a lot of time to go through this, but a kind of ongoing meditation about this wayward quantity of equipment that goes back all the way to things from Enrico Fermi and early atomic energy research and the Chicago pile. Some of you may recall this was the birthplace this university in this neighborhood of the atomic age and the first self-sustaining atomic reaction. So project, came out of that context. And then a project I did for Documenta 14 called the Ingot Project that looked at scrap copper and copper networks historically and in the present in Athens, and then in Kassel, a kind of parallel project that looked at industrial networks and recycling networks and scavenging of metals in relation to iron. And so an installation of iron ingots and kind of speculations on the global economy and the local scrap economies. Here's some ingot production. From this factory. So you maybe get a sense of, the kind of networks and materials and, kind of time-based investigations that I'm interested in. This last thing I'll mention, and then I'll get onto experimental station, is Sulfur Cycle project, which is currently at the MCA here in Chicago and is also readily searchable. And it's actually a two-part project. 25 years ago, I did Sulfur Cycle project that involved tracking sulfur through a filtration process. It gets a little bit technical and I can't get too much into it here, but it's tracking 1 ton of sulfur that is derived from coal. And when it's burned, that sulfur becomes an air pollution. In order to filter that sulfur out of the air pollution, it's embedded in a limestone slurry that creates synthetic gypsum. And there was an innovative industrial pathway being developed where that gypsum went into the wallboard industry and then into buildings. And so 25 years ago, I exhibited stacks of drywall and then built the 1 ton of sulfur into the new museum at the time being built here in Chicago. Here's a diagram of the sulfur cycle in nature and a kind of industrial look at it. That's a video that cycles on and off in the current exhibition. So now this is a companion exhibition 25 years later, after the original sulfur cycle, and it involves excavating within the walls of the museum after 25 years of operation. And the video you saw was of an endless coal loader, and the coal and that kind of endless appetite for energy is the origin of this project and the origin of the sulfur. And then these, oops, I'm sorry. Didn't mean to open that little side window. How do I close that? The pieces that were cut out of the walls were then assembled into a horizontal structure here that a kind of painting-sized object that allows you to look into the gypsum of the wall where that sulfur, that 1 ton of sulfur is chemically residing. So this is what the exhibition looks like now. But an interesting thing in the sense that it spans 25 years and looks at the way the project has evolved and meaning around the project has evolved. So, okay. That's probably most of my 10 minutes, but let's leap quickly here to the experimental station. This is the site back in the early 70s on the south side of Chicago, adjacent to the University of Chicago, not far from the lakefront, and actually part of a neighborhood that had quite turbulent history of change. And at this point of time in the 60s and 70s, there was a lot of disinvestment, abandonment, became a predominantly African-American neighborhood with some of the lowest per capita and lowest household income per family in Chicago. This is an aerial shot of the building. You can see it's kind of a odd shaped building, and it used to be surrounded by apartment buildings, but all of those had come down in various stages of abandonment and then clearance. This is directly across the street from the University of Chicago, so it's not a fringe remote site. I got involved with the company that owned that building that had been active since the 70s. So there was a connection to some counterculture activities stemming from the 60s and 70s, meaning environmental viewpoints, urban gardening, a variety of kind of social experiments that, you know, aligned with the spirit of the day. Most of them had fallen by the wayside by the time I got involved, but I was really interested in picking up some of those ideas and reestablishing the building as a kind of multi-use site. So one of the first things that I was involved with was starting a bicycle shop, a model of a bike shop run for kids in the neighborhood, so they could participate in an economy of the bike shop, bank the hours they spent working there, use their hours to purchase bikes and bike parts. And so it was a business model, but first and foremost, it was a kind of alternative education strategy. I can mention in relation to this site that, you know, I'm speaking as an artist, but as somebody who getting involved in this kind of a project really took on all the tasks needed in terms of, you know, legal work, design work, building labor work, you know, whatever was necessary. And I'm sure Christoph can speak to some of that too. There are lots of demands of kind of launching something like this. But here are a few sketches. This is what the building eventually turned into as I continued to build and create, you know, different spaces for the bike shop, a wood shop, kitchen, exhibition space, office spaces. My studio was in there. But ideally, you know, I was looking for a kind of sustainable constellation of different activities that could make the building work, but really push in different directions. Publishing, the Baffler magazine that some of you may recall was published here, as well as a variety of visiting artist projects then overlaid on that level of activity. In 2001, we had a fire, pretty devastating fire, as you can see. It was at a time, this is not our building, but a neighboring building, a time where the city and the transformation of the south side of Chicago was quite aggressively ramping up. This is a nearby building, also disappearing due to the expansion of the University of Chicago. We were caught in those kinds of pressures that, as many of you know, can be really quite intense, especially for a kind of small, underground, not well financially endowed organization. It was a real challenge to exist. So here's our building again after the fire, stripped down to the walls that we had to fight for in court to be able to rebuild on these walls. So this is after the demolition, after the fire. We were really tasked with new construction within these walls, but had we not kept the walls, we would have lost our control of the site, even though this was privately owned. Again, there's a long story in that process, but as you can see, a kind of exciting rebuild process. This is the building early after rebuilding after the fire, and you can see gardens and some interesting retrofitting of the old building. The bike shop was reestablished. Blackstone Bicycle Works. Here's a view inside. The gardens were actually maintained throughout the years of construction and struggling for building permits and so forth. It became quite lush and busy. We started a farmer's market, and bringing a market to the south side here was quite important in this neighborhood. And we also established a program with Link Up Illinois, which is a food stamp program for poor residents who obtain food financial aid. That this was the first market that could accept food stamps and provide discounts for high quality organic food, but provide discounts through the Link Up Illinois program. And that has turned into a program that now Experimental Station administers for the entire state of Illinois for all farmers markets. So it became a really unexpected kind of expansion project of just trying to bring food to a neighborhood that was sorely lacking. Inside, we have a terrific bread baking oven and kitchen space. We do lots of different kinds of social events, indoor and outdoor. We've got some land outside of the building as well as in. This main space serves as a workshop, also concert, reading, events, different kinds of spaces. This was a workshop with an architecture program in France that came to Chicago and really actively engaged questions of architecture and public health. And so anyway, the building is truly a multifunctional building and has very adaptable, flexible spaces. A visiting artist who came to Chicago for 3 or 4 months, Peggy Pierrot, who has a journalistic sociology background, and in a way was a perfect fit for working with Experimental Station and the variety of organizations that we're working with, and a kind of connectedness to the South Side. So, we have an active a visiting artist program. And then I want to talk just a little bit about the Invisible Institute. You can look them up on the Experimental Station site. This is a group that's really reinventing journalism, given the loss of investigative journalism, newspaper reporting jobs, the changes within journalism. And so it's an investigative journalistic team led by Jamie Calvin, who is there on the right. They've been really influential in Chicago on opening up police abuse cases. They've been involved in video projects about what were identified as justified police shootings that through careful local investigating have been revealed to be not so justified, and have really opened up questionable practices of policing in Chicago. And they continue to really move forward as a really dynamic, innovative organization. And this is actually part of a space that I used as my studio, but made available for a project that the Invisible Institute was doing with forensic architecture that perhaps most of you know of, the London-based forensic architecture project, where they teamed up to investigate a local shooting on the South Side of a man named Harith Augustus. You could track this if you go to the forensic architecture site and look up the killing of Harith Augustus. And it was basically a routine kind of police stop that ended up with, escalating for no really good reason into a kind of chaotic confrontation. And Harith Augustus was shot dead in front of where he worked. And so this exhibition involved 6 different video projects looking at the timeframes around the shooting. And it was fascinating because it was a local project, but also the collaboration with Forensic Architecture and Invisible Institute meant that the exhibition was a really active working lab and ongoing workshop for this journalistic team. You know, they're already in this building and part of the experimental station community, and to have this exhibition and the videos while they're still processing in a journalistic sense the aftermath of this shooting and other shootings, and dealing with policymakers in Chicago. It really had a fascinating impact to kind of make this flexible use of the building and a kind of exhibition available in relation to this journalistic effort.
I'm sorry, Dan. I'm afraid I have to interrupt for a moment because we kind of need to pass on to Christoph for his presentation.
Yeah, I'm at the end here. This
Okay.
is just the last thing I wanted to show. So I'm exactly at the end. Sorry, I'm sure I went a little bit over, but
It's okay. We can
this is
discuss
a
some of
perfect
this
moment.
in the
Mhm.
conversation later. Thank you.
Yeah.
And Christoph, are you ready? You are muted.
Yes, I just, hi everybody. Thanks a lot to Dan, and we will see how I do time-wise. Otherwise, maybe we will, if I manage those Dan Peterman 10 minutes.
I'm sorry, apologies everybody.
It's fine.
Actually, I very much enjoyed it, but I hope you can see my presentation now. I totally forgot that to show different works, and also because I found it totally unrealistic. So time-wise. And I chose a very unspecific title because before this meeting started, we had to sign some kind of contract where you had to choose if you are a controversial or a boring artist. I don't know if you had to do this also, Dan. And I didn't want to create problems, so I said I'm a boring artist and a totally scientific position. So please be prepared for a boring talk. I want to actually talk about the entanglements and the relationships of projects I have been involved with. But in preparation to this talk, we in this case Dan and me were especially talking a lot about historic predecessors, so to say, and influences from inside and outside of art. And I hope we can come back to that, but I would like to start with a very, very influential squat that without the Hafenstraße in Hamburg, without which Park Fiction would not have been thinkable. And Hafenstraße, as you can see here, started, I think, in the early 80s. I'm not even sure if 1983 is correct. And it kind of became a legal co-op in 1992. So that was a time of hard struggles, and I want to show you only a very few pictures so that you get an idea of the type of struggle in the late 80s, which kind of marked these struggles around houses and squats. This is a police group that tries to enter one of the squatted houses. This photo was taken by Margit, my colleague, Park Fiction colleague Margit, from her balcony, basically. And this is the house on the other side of the street, which was one of the 6 houses or so, which were part of the Hafenstraße squad. And I take the freedom to zoom into this just to show you this type of helicopter police placed by helicopters on the rooftops so that they can come and enter these houses. The struggles were very, very escalated, and I also show you a picture of how they were won, which was taken maybe a year or two later. One of the, and you can see one of the probably 10, 12 barricades that were surrounding the Hafenstraße for many, for 14 days in 1987. Which was the point of escalation when the city tried to evict the houses, alas, not successfully. And the situation was escalated militantly, and the squatters in the end won. However, this situation of such a hard struggle continued for a very, very long time, and actually several years. And these very, very precarious and also dangerous conditions where people were followed around by the police, and when they were away far enough, they were caught and brought to prison for no reason at all, and so on, is something that you can not so easily, how do you say, continue. And so the experience of many squads when they had won was very often that after that the situation gets much more bourgeois or calm, and sometimes very, very depoliticized. And there's nothing wrong with this, maybe, but it's, I think the interesting thing with Park Fiction is that we found a way to transform this energy into something that could continue the type of struggle in a new form. So I want to show you that that was the main reason. So yeah, this is the "How do we get out of here" donut. I don't want to be silent about all the influences that Hafenstraße had. For everybody who is familiar with the German leftist situation, I think one of the most important things is that Hafenstraße reinvented the football fandom around the football club of FC St. Pauli, and started the first anti-fascist fan group in the early 90s. And this had a tremendous effect on football fans and fan culture in Germany and far beyond, I think, and is a very, very important point in politics, and why there is still a leftist politics in Hamburg, for instance, with a very strong fan base in the football club. This is also a product of the Hafenstraße. So it was, but Park Fiction, this is a map. You have Hafenstraße here. Can you see my mouse? No. Yep. Can you see my mouse?
Yes, we can.
Oh, super.
Yes,
this is super. So Hafenstraße is here. Park Fiction is right next to it. The whole thing is located at the River Elbe, and St. Pauli is an amusement area, and very close by is the Reeperbahn with the red light district. So what we did to get out of this kind of militant confrontational situation was that we continued to do direct action, but we called it production of desires, parallel planning process, activities that anticipate future uses, and do this in a playful and inviting fashion. And I will just show you a very few pictures, very, very few, sorry. So, for instance, with Park Fiction, the question was that the city wanted to sell this piece of land that you can see here and build houses there. And our idea was, in continuation also with the squatters' struggles, that we did not want houses to be built there. We wanted to protect the Poodle Club, and we wanted to design a park there in the neighborhood. And instead now of protesting, we started this parallel planning process in the neighborhood. And for instance, on the American style little sign there, you could see the poodle that who demands a poodle-shaped hedge. And here you can see the poodle-shaped hedge finished park. Or another example would be of the way that we worked would be activities anticipating the desire for parks, like grilling between parked cars, where today there is a park. We also invented new tools to make planning more accessible. I go through this very, very briefly. And for instance, this game board is somehow typical of our approach, that we kind of made a totally transparent way of like a diagram of how we could proceed with and how you could approach the planning process. And you could actually play this like a game, but it was also like a flow diagram that shows how the process, we imagined the process to be. So we had an archive of desires, the plasticine office. These were all the access points, a hotline for people who are inspired late at night, and an action kit for house visits that people could plan at home. Also part of this was listening, in contrast to what usually art is about, this monologous situation. For Park Fiction, it's totally central that others, that you create a platform of exchange where everybody's voice can be heard and articulated. This, for instance, is a project that children from a neighboring children's house, they built a model for the park, for instance, for the future park. And of course, the most important thing was the network around, which was kind of transformed from a support network of the squad. It became an active network of neighbors. Neighbors didn't have the support role anymore, but the role of people who think out what they want and what they want the city to look like. Also, maybe not unimportant, we started community meetings with this project to establish those, or community assemblies would be the more precise term, actually. And this is also an effect that somehow from our project was continued. In the Hafenstraße squad already had very interesting assemblies, a neighborhood assembly and internal assembly. But from there, it did not automatically continue as a assembly of the neighborhood. With Park Fiction, we somehow, how do you call that, constituted this assembly as a tool where the neighborhood would come together and make decisions. The park since then has become also a point of reference for the right to the city movement and for other political movements, a stage for other political movements, like Fridays for Future and so on. So Karen asked me to also go briefly into the Esso Houses. I would have loved to show more about the right to the city movement in Hamburg, where the Park Fiction was kind of influential for. But the Esso Houses is a different conflict at the Reeperbahn in the vicinity, but in a much, much bigger scale, money-wise, and in a highly already gentrified situation, which we didn't have in the mid-90s. These are the Esso Houses, and they were bought in 2010 by a big investor. And the plan was to tear them down. People were resisting this and refusing to go, but however, they were a shake went through the houses in 2013 and they had to be cleared. And this was the moment when we and many fan groups of the football club called for a community conference. And on this community conference, we again started a planning group and a planning studio, the Planbude, planning shack. And we much refined the tools from Park Fiction. We developed these tactical furniture to plan in the streets, Lego models to so that you could build models, a plasticine office which allowed you to plan in scale 1 to 500, night cards, and so on. I don't go into the details. The idea behind it was that we wanted to crack collectively the St. Pauli Code and develop criteria what a building must be able to do so that St. Pauli can be continued in it. We planned in bars and so on, and in the end there were over 2,300 contributions in the Archive of Desires. In this case, we did not do what we did with Park Fiction, the parallel planning process, but what we did was we did this officially employed by the local government because we wanted to have a strong voice against the investors. Again, a final meeting decided about the main ideas, or decided is the wrong idea in this case. We presented all the ideas and accentuated them and so on. Can't go into the details, developed the St. Pauli Code and conditions and briefings for the architects. And the final design has become a totally different thing from, so the investors had to accept this, and this is basically the design we are dealing with now, a kind of approachable architecture. There will be 1/3 social housing, no privately owned condos, but rental flats will be 1/3, and roughly 1/3 will be a kind of housing project co-op-like thing. And the front, all the ground floor will be accessible, public access buildings. Many of the former inhabitants of the buildings can return if they are still alive once it's ready and finished. And there will be a cluster which we call the subculture cluster. And there will be usable rooftops, for instance. However, Park Fiction also continues at the moment, and in front of our park, here on the left is the park, and in front of it there's this gray area, concrete area directly at the river. And we started a production of Desires for that last summer, actually, no, in 2020, in the pandemic summer with open air planning and a new group. And this year we continued with a series of discussions with specific experts. And I think we will manage to get this also. And that's where I want to end. Thank you.
Oh, perfect. I was about to jump in with my questions. You read my mind, Christoph.
That's very nice. Thank you, YY.
And thank you very much for the amazing presentations. And I'm sure our audience are buzzing with questions because we've been open to many topics and interesting areas and for us to explore. But we will first have maybe 15 minutes of conversation time before we open the floor for the Q&A. Does that sound good to all of you? Yeah. And yeah, I think the very first question, maybe just fall back on what Christoph just presented, kind of Park Fiction code, because previously we've discussed, is it possible to do like multiple pack fiction model elsewhere? And then this question can also extend back to Dan. You know, can you see the experimental station being replicant in other global regions, like a global movement together? Can you see this happening?
I think I just start, and of course it's super inspiring to see a project like Experimental Station, and also to see, hey, it's possible to have this kind of an interesting group like the Invisible Institute, and at the same time be a social project in a neighborhood. For instance, this is this degree of intellectuality and different knowledges in one building. I think this is so impressive. And on the one hand, one thinks like, yes, of course you could copy it, but you cannot copy exactly this combination. Yeah, we have been thinking about this, especially with the Planbude project. The question of scale really becomes an issue. But if we would look maybe at these projects in 10 years time, or let's say 7 years time, and if everything goes well, these buildings will be built, but it will be so full with, pumped up with money that no matter what you do, you know, and no matter how good the contracts get, you will have a very, very different situation than the somehow still breathing the air of self-organization of the experimental station, for instance. It's somehow, because the conflict is so harsh, you know, this question of scale is really serious, I think. And it's not possible to scale things up simply from these. On the other hand, I think often we get asked from you know, the art context somehow would like not to have these type of projects as models, because then it's easier to continue with this replicable normal art. So I'm in a difficult situation, because I think, yes, there's a lot of it that the world should know. And I think the art field should find ways how to show it and discuss it, and that these projects are still part of the art world. At the same time, I think I'm more and more sure that it's a good quality if you can't scale them up.
It's interesting you brought up the art world. That can also be an extra question for Dan too, like how your role as an artist and how does it work together in your role in your art world?
Yeah, I mean, there are different tactics around every move you make, I think, as an artist, working with institutions, working in other cities, and then strategies for like in your own neighborhood where your life is really integrated. Yeah, there are different ways of being, and you know, as we've spoken about earlier, I felt like I very often was managing visibility as an artist and the visibility of what I was doing as an art project, because I often was cautious, like that's not the right front for what's going on in a way, because it's a stronger position to be doing something that people actively try to figure out, and not just say, oh, you know, it's some artists goofing around in between times where the real forces come in and transform the city, or you know, the gentrification kind of moves ahead. Like it's just it can be too easily written off or recognized as a limited in scope, or at least that was a feeling, you know, I had at various periods of time. It kind of changes, but you know, the tactics to that question of, is it replicable, you know, or could models scale? I think the model that can scale is to empower artists locally where you find them, and, you know, to feed them kinds of information, but there are such clear differences. Like I'm fascinated by football fans becoming part of Park Fiction team. It can't happen in the US that we could, create a power base of sports fans, around an art project, or the idea of squats, because the police mechanism just operates so forcefully and so quickly, and the landowners and the money is so empowered. There is no such thing as a squat. You'll end up evicted, and maybe there's a recourse in court, but tactically you really have to have a kind of survival mindset that's different. I mean, both cities, both Hamburg and Chicago, I think you have to learn to survive, but they're really different set of tools. And it was wonderful for me as an artist over time to see what Park Fiction was doing over a long period of time, and to recognize that, yeah, some of those tactics would be terrific, particularly the kind of citizenship claiming of the design process, the archives of desire. I mean, that's a real battle zone, like who's legitimately putting their ideas forward.
Yes.
And it's something
May I
please,
jump in, quickly, because Dan, thank you. First of all, thank you for your really, really great presentations. I think they were, even though they were very short, they were extremely insightful, at least for me. One question that I would like to ask you, Dan, because Christoph kind of situated his project very strongly in a political situation. Yeah. If you could elaborate a little bit more on that, and also how this has changed during the decades.
Yeah, again, it can be a complicated answer, but the simple one is that, when I talked about that neighborhood boundary, you have to kind of understand how intense neighborhood boundaries can be in American cities. And integrated with histories of, like in Chicago, those boundaries are impacted by the riots. Chicago's had two intense riots in 1968 around the Democratic Convention, and then around the death of Martin Luther King. Over 200 buildings were burned. Neighborhoods of Chicago really looked, there was so much uncertainty around how does the city function? How does the city continue in this kind of turbulence? And this neighborhood was a witness and party, experienced that kind of trauma, like urban trauma. And there's a long lasting effect that it's only in only recently, I mean, that it feels like institutions have kind of caught up again after the decades of paranoia and the divisiveness and a kind of urban dysfunctionalism, like where taxis won't drive to a certain neighborhood, or students from the university shouldn't cross this street, or Black youth shouldn't be on campus because they might get picked up for suspicion of stealing bikes or whatever. This kind of dysfunctional, paranoid urbanism that was really entrenched here. And that intensity, we could really talk about for a long time around the experimental station and being on a boundary where those things really played out. And it had a transformative sense, a transformative effect on whether people walk down that street or not, whether a single woman could feel comfortable walking, whether kids could feel comfortable riding their bikes, or whether they're navigating gang territories, or, and again, just the last thing I'll lay on the top of this is the intensity of handgun violence. The South Side of Chicago in the 90s, 400 to 500 handgun-related homicides per year, just on the South Side, certain neighborhood. I mean, those numbers are just phenomenal. So there's this overwhelming sense of safety around youth. What is a spot for after school? How are people navigating? Do kids have access to bikes or public transit, or are these neighborhoods where infrastructure has been eroding for decades. And so, it's hard to exaggerate the kind of dysfunctional urbanism, almost that has been in play in the recent past, and then how kind of brutal the transformative process is when suddenly we're going to become a new neighborhood. We're being intensely gentrified, developed, and the Obama Library is coming here. The University of Chicago has new strategies, etc.
Why? Should we open the floor to the other?
Yeah,
Because there are already some questions in the chat. One
yeah,
by
sure.
Lisanne Büschel. Maybe you want to just unmute yourself, Lisanne, and ask your question? Or would you rather like me to read it out?
Yeah, I can unmute myself if you can hear me.
Yes.
Yes, perfect.
So I asked how both of you see the role of your project, despite the best intentions and the sort of counter practices that you outlined, in perhaps eventually amplifying the gentrification pressures of the neighborhoods around the projects, or if in specific instances or as a sort of framework, you have actually found ways of creating barriers to the displacement of even the most marginalized. So I recognize that you've tried to incorporate elements of, for example, having affordable housing for certain people to return in Christoph's Esso Houses project, or the bike shop. But those are sort of instances, of decreasing the gentrification pressure. But I think typically what we see is that over time, these projects do tend to amplify gentrification, and the most vulnerable or most marginalized do tend to get displaced. And yeah, just wondering on both of your thoughts on this.
Yeah, I can answer quickly, and then maybe Christoph has more to talk about that. I really don't have the answer, because you're absolutely right. It does play in to some extent, as you claim space, you make it more convivial, you kind of build a quality of life for citizens. You end up participating in a kind of transformation. And all I can say is that at every place you look at who's there, who has been there, who's in the neighborhood, and what the needs are locally, and how can you stabilize that so that it's not, I mean, there are ways that you can provide resources to help anchor people in the community as opposed to displacing. Like every little decision seems to have some resonant effect on either stabilizing or accelerating, some process of gentrification. Even like question of, if you have a garden, a community garden, how you run the politics of that garden can be huge in terms of people from outside coming in and now claiming recreational use of space versus maybe working harder to pull people who've not been feeling access, to community gardens and, stabilizing residents of the neighborhood. So it's a complicated, there's no easy answer in my perspective, other than you just constantly try to stabilize who's there and work with your neighbors as well as you can.
Yeah, I thanks for the question. I think it's actually the answer is not easy, but on the one hand, since the financial crisis in 2008, 2009, actually the gentrification science says there is no such thing anymore as an influence of small art projects on gentrification in this direct way that we kind of saw in the 80s, or in the time when Martha Rosler was doing her If I Do Lived Here show in the DR Art Foundation. So now it's kind of such a global phenomenon that the price tag on a city like Hamburg is there, and the rent gap situation, which is the driver of gentrification in the concrete situations. So the rent gap, that there is a possibility to make much more money while actually people pay very small prices in a neighborhood. That's what drives gentrification and what drives in investors, because the profit margin is the biggest in these situations, in rent gap situations. So the rent gap situation now is for instance, for the whole city of Hamburg. It's not anymore for just one area. Even though the prices are totally outrageous here, one must say. But so that's the overall thing. One shouldn't be, I think art is not in a powerful position anymore to drive forward gentrification. And then there's a lot of dialectic in this game. So for instance, I always hated intermediate youth people, you know, people who go into, who take a very short-term contract, open their self-organized gallery or something like that, or art space, and then move out again, and when the prices go up. However, in Hamburg, the biggest squat in the last 20 years, and actually the only successful squat, it doesn't happen a lot here, Dan, anymore. It's actually not possible.
I know it's not as often. No.
But then there was this wonder in 2009 that 16 houses in the inner cities were squatted only by artists, and many of them had learned how to take these kind of spaces in these intermediate projects. So they had been an active tool of capitalism before. And now, in a different situation, this turned totally against it. So I think this fantasy of being a part of, there's no way to be not a part of gentrification, because there's no way to be not a part of capitalism. But this also means you can develop something in it as a kind of resistance. So as Park Fiction also was part of the Right to the City movement and part of the founding of this. And this again is was very influential on the Berlin, for instance, the rent cut movements in Berlin, for instance, which now have a big effect on the German discussions. Now it's coming to a level where you can again operate, I think, against gentrification, because you need harsh interventions by the state. Otherwise, small movements don't do this anymore. It has to be harsh interventions.
Yeah, we have very few tools here for just to protect neighborhoods from the explosiveness of economic change, of speculation. You know, we don't have a lot of strong tools in the US.
But you used to have, for instance, in New York, there was a law against chain stores. And that is, for instance, something, I think it was dismantled only 15 or 20 years ago. But people here are also so much believing in neoliberalism and the great character of the market as a force, that no one can imagine that this could be installed here. But I think that would be very, very interesting to do. I wonder if you have if this was the wrong answer, Lisanne Püschel.
Yeah.
If you will have a question, please raise your hand. And
I saw that Lisanne Püschel switched off her mic, because it would be lovely to get into a dialogue.
Yeah.
I wasn't planning on it. I mean, if others have questions, maybe they want to ask them first. If not, I mean, I don't know if there's a right or wrong answer. I agree with both of you. I think it was a really mean question of me to ask, because if we had the solution to
no, it's something we all discuss in our groups, actually, I think. And I think a place like Dan's experimental station is, I'm quite sure it's the neighborhood meetings against gentrification happen there. And if they wouldn't happen there, I don't know where they would happen. And important meetings against gentrification often start in Park Fiction. and I'm actually not sure if it has a gender. It's such, people are starting to complain about the park and its dirtiness on Google. So it's not really, maybe not so gentrifying as one would think.
Yeah, I mean, there are such
then
curious twists in this too. I mean, that question of scale, because it occurred to me as the Obama library is being built, you know, big project on the south side, claiming parkland next to the lake, $850 million project. And as far as presidential libraries that have in the past been more like a monument to the legacy, right? This is on the south side of Chicago, and the Obamas really wanted to be a multi-purpose kind of center, right? And it feels like, okay, now the presidential library is going to be an experimental station. Like, what have we have we done? Of course, we haven't done anything. But it feels like, you know, some of this idea, like, you can't help but be kind of woven into, you know, the fabric of like new visions of the neighborhood if you've really been an active participant in envisioning and in changing and in critiquing, you know, and just our growth trajectory has created more dependence on foundations, and you know, there's a variety of reasons that scaling is really a challenge, as opposed to like starting grassroots nodes, you know, elsewhere.
Could you maybe elaborate a little bit more on your own role? I know that you both work in collectives, and that whether the experimental station and the Park Fiction project, they both were not just grounded on you, but maybe you can elaborate a little bit on that.
Yeah, should I go, Christoph?
Yeah,
first?
yeah.
Just quickly, you know, as an artist, the origin of the building and the kind of multi-use center was, it was kind of operated out of my studio. And I saw myself as a participant in it and equal among other participants in various activities in this building and making it work and moving towards sustainability. So it was a fairly primitive model and kind of a trust-based model. And I would say probably heavy-handed leadership on my part, but you know, one that was trusted by people involved in it. Because we burned down and had such a dramatic struggle to rebuild and come back, and to then be more stable as an organization, needing a new economy, needing a board to help fundraising, you know, to operate in this building that we had somehow managed to rebuild. It just meant we're in a new economy. And we had an experimental station. I mean, actually, when we adopted that name and became a not-for-profit, we became more of a vertical hierarchy, even though we're still a not-for-profit. Board of directors, you know, writing grants to foundations to, you know, be sure that we could keep the jobs that we were trying to create stable, that people got paid, you know, so the business model was more central and more vertical. And I would say we came out of a very horizontal, in the sense that probably Park Fiction was operating, you know, more in a kind of artist led, you know, horizontal model, as opposed to building like economic hierarchy. So, you know, and that's a challenge. I mean, I know for me personally, there's a point at which I have my limits to growth, and really start to look back to other models that are more grassroots and operate on a different level of kind of horizontal networking, as opposed to like achieving some kind of constant growth and expansion or upward mobility.
Well, the role. Thank you. The role. I don't know. It's shifting so much in every project, and it's really very often actually, because art has a very funny smell, so to say, and a class connection. Yeah, it's actually more the art as a term in the German setting or in the Western setting has a kind of elite kind of, it means it's usually used as a synonym for something good. If it's art, it's good. And so sometimes it's better to just have the citizen position. And not only for tactical reasons, also for political reasons and ethical reasons. It's I think it's sometimes better to act as a citizen, and at the same time, the playfulness and the way that the perspective can change through art. That's what I expect as a role in these settings. Of course, it is a lot of knowledge one brings in, and something that can really enrich processes. And but again, of course, I always work with the hypothesis that everybody can be this artist. And it's always about extending this role of, I don't want to hear the middle class idea of love drama again and again. That's boring. It's the interesting thing in projects like that is that you get in contact with other people, other visions, other, and that you kind of create a situation where this really can have impact. Yeah, that's I think the. But it's not a clean role, so to say. So that makes it not easy to describe what one is doing, because it's like when you play cards with someone, you have to put money on the table. So you can, and the money in these projects is maybe also subjectivity, you know. So you cannot leave your artistic subjectivity out and say, please be subjective, everybody. I won't do that. I'm the scientist, or I'm the artist. I'm the person that steps back. This engineer's position I don't want, and I think it's also false. But it brings me into trouble all the time.
We actually received a really good questions from Angela. Would Angela actually like to step in and speak to the speakers directly, or you want us to read it out?
Yeah, I mean, the question is written so that everybody can see it. And I do bring my experience from Athens here and from anti-fascist organizing, I have to say. So I'm very pleased. I always wanted to hear the story. I wrote to Christoph before to thank him. Thank you both for the fantastic information provided here. So, I mean, my question is, and because I teach spark fiction, you know, as a topic, but I place it historically almost at this point. For students, and the reason for this is that we have a configuration of direct repression through the police. We have a crackdown on the squads, as far as I know, at least, from Holland to Athens. We also have new subjects that, for most parts of the European Union, a constant point of crisis, like migrants who are housed in these constantly illegalized squads. So my question is actually whether you can see, because this doesn't concern just one nation state, whether you see this social practice with the involvement of art kind of surviving in this new articulation of business, you know, of neoliberalism and neo-authoritarianism. For some, it's neo-fascism, but the police plays a crucial role. And I don't know how it is in Hamburg. I can tell you how it is, how it has been, and how it is in Athens, which has been a very, you know, kind of vibrant place for squads, for this kind of art and so on. And it's been bad. We're talking about extreme physical violence, police brutality, and a constant illegalization of this art, even, I would say. So the question is, do you think it will survive? I mean, how, you know, I know things were not easy when you did them, but the present moment seems particularly dystopian for me. to me.
Yeah, maybe I reply to it directly? Because of course I cannot, this is something we will have to find out collectively. But I think we need, of course, a shift, I think, to get to bigger types of politics on the one hand. I'm quite, so because this type of repression, I mean, and this type of alienation and expulsion of whole groups of out of the society and so on is like big politics. And at the same time, these small projects can operate as points of resistance in this. And if it's resistance is already a big word, because a park is no resistance point, I must say. It's a space with an image and so on, and a usage and so on, and it's public, but the police goes there also, and we have seen many more police here, which is but not because of also against the local migrant scene around the Hafenstraße and in the park. It's totally unsolved, I must say, this project. Hey, there's Olga suddenly on my screen. So I can't, but I think it's some of the tactics might be interesting. I think this idea of working parallel is something that could work under situations of repression, probably better than the direct confrontation, which is too costly very often for people.
Dan, you are muted. We have roughly 3-4 minutes left.
Okay, just a quick response about like to this question of Angela's question. Will it survive? Will the tactics survive? And you know, there appears to be a lot of evidence and a lot of reasons why you know, it will survive in zones that are kind of free enough, open enough, neglected enough for them to survive. But that when it's pushed through the filters of, you know, like where Experimental Station is now, just as an example, I couldn't do what I did in the 80s. Like the scrutiny would be too high, the regulatory pressures on the building, and therefore the economy I would have needed, I could have never stepped in and done what I was able to do more through conditions of neglect that allowed me to operate with a certain kind of creativity and adaptability. And there've been some factors like the ghost ship fire, where I think 17 or 18 young people died in a building, you know, owned by artists, an event building, but, you know, it wasn't up to code. It didn't follow all the building standards. And I really strongly identified having a kind of artist-run building that also burned. And fortunately, nobody was hurt. But the stakes of trying to really have a fully fire code building, like to be a developer and then say you want to step in as artists and be creative and responsive to neighbors, and you don't want to drive things into you know, this upwardly spiraling economy. It's really challenging unless, you know, you continue to kind of find areas of neglect or abandonment where there's some freedom to operate before the forces to kind of standardize everything come into play.
I want to thank you for that, because you added bureaucracy and administration, which is directly at the core of the biopolitical, you know, development of the state and capital we're going through, as the other pole of the direct police repression. So I'm just wondering indeed if what allowed socially engaged art even to emerge out of community art was very much tied precisely to a different moment in the development of capitalism, kind of, and I'm not sure that we're still at the same. That's what I'm saying. Really, but it doesn't mean that we cannot think of tactics. It depends how far, of course, artists and anybody behaving as an artist like to go.
And there are lots of tactics that are nomadic and mobile, and there are other tactics that I know both Christoph and I that have been really interested in. Is like we want to hold our grounds. We want to be in a place that connects to where we live, and so there's a whole different set of criteria of what allows you to really hold place over a longer period of time.
Thank you.
I'm really not in the position to give any advice or something like that. But of course, I think the situation, you know, in Greece, where I must say, I feel really bad how the Germans put pressure when you had the leftist government. And this disappointment in this context must be so big that it's not easy to kind of come back to a pace that you had in 2000, maybe 11 or 12, when the Occupy movements were in Athens and so on. So I think, yeah, I mean, this is totally not easy, but I'm, in a way, I am trusting humankind to find again its sense for collectivity and fighting the police state off. I can't imagine a police state to exist in the long run, but I mean, it's looks sinister, but yeah.
Hey, let's not end in this bad note. Yes, but I also have to do some policing. I'm afraid it's the time for us to close this lecture, but our amazing project coordinator, Fabi, has set up a chat room for us called Wonder, and he has posted the link on the chat box, and we can continue our conversation there. And again, thank you so much for everyone for coming. Thank you so much for Christoph. Thank you so much to Dan. And my personal great thank you for Kahan for guiding me through my first ever Fine Art lecture moderation. And also a big thank you to Elena for setting up this event. And on a last note, our next upcoming lecture will be by Helena Reckitt on feminist care and curating, and it will be moderated by two fabulous colleagues of mine, Maria and Fabiola. And hopefully we will see you all there. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye
you.
now.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.